Okay, so welcome everyone to Dimitri Live. My name is Maria Van Vlies, and I am a PhD researcher currently working on climate change education and youth mental health at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. I'm an educator and a facilitator, and I also happen to be Dimitri's cousin. So I know him better than most, I would say. But before I get into my conversation with Dimitri, I did want to engage in a land acknowledgement. And I wanted to acknowledge that we're gathered today on the customary and traditional lands of the Indigenous and Métis people, of the territories in which we reside and are participating from today. And I recognize that people may be watching or participating from different places. I'm currently located in the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas of the Credit on the traditional Dish with One Spoon Treaty territory. And we recognize, again, that depending on where you are in diverse traditional territories. We respectfully recognize the presence of Indigenous peoples, both in the past and the present, and we commit to action, to education, to meaningful dialogue, and the very necessary change. It's important to acknowledge the lands from which we gather today, to discuss the consequences and the ideas that we have for world events and for what happens on these lands and our commitments in these times, and that we recognize the historical impact and the multi-generational effects that residential schools, oppressive laws, and broken treaties have had on Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. Along with this acknowledgement, we must continue to engage all members of our communities in education about Indigenous history, about treaties, and the rich culture and traditions of Indigenous peoples. We must act in solidarity to support Indigenous sovereignty over their traditional territories and ways of life, and to restore land unjustly taken. We offer our gratitude for their care of and teachings about our earth and our relations. And may we honor those teachings in all that we do. So Dimitri, I feel like that's a really good starting point because both of us, we're first generation immigrants. We are the children of those who came from other lands to these lands. And I don't know that we really got an opportunity through our education system to understand what actually has been going on. And I think that has come later, and it's really a huge gap in our education system that's starting to be addressed. But we're immigrants, and our parents, our parents were immigrants, and so our lives are unfolding on this place. But again, I know you probably better than most people. Is that fair to say that I'm one of the people who probably knows you?
I count the number of people who know me as well as you on one hand. My wife and kids come to mind.
Yes, absolutely.
You are definitely, a person with whom I have been close in so many ways for so long, and you have been borne personal witness to the quite extensive evolution that I've gone through as a human being over the course of my life. You know that over the course of my life, my politics evolved quite dramatically, although it took a long time for me to get to the place where I am today. I want to say two things. First of all, though, cousin, before we proceed. First of all, I'm in Saskatoon today, and I'm on Treaty 6 territory of the Crae, Dene, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Ojibwe First Nation, the Métis Nation, and I honor them in being a guest on their land here today. I want to say one thing about my upbringing, which is relevant to this, and that is, yes, I as like you, am a child of Greek immigrants who came here to Canada. We're fortunate to have the opportunity to come here from a war-torn and devastated nation. And I was educated in a school called Sir John A. Macdonald Public School in London, Ontario. And I didn't find out until about a few years ago, frankly, that Sir John A. Macdonald was, to be perfectly candid about it, an anti-Indigenous racist. They never taught me that about Sir John A. Macdonald. They never suggested that he was anything other than a great Canadian hero. And I think that it really speaks volumes about how far we are from the promise of reconciliation, that even at this late date, we don't understand that as Canadians, that this supposed hero of our history was an anti-Indigenous racist who has a great deal to answer for. and that we should no longer honor his legacy.
Absolutely. And we're so implicated. We're so implicated in, in what has happened. And, it's hard to reconcile in ourselves to realize that we're settlers. And when we understand the violence and that in essence, we've unwittingly come into this, we've come into these histories and legacies. And so we have a responsibility. And this is something that we have to commit to in these times, is really understanding, learning, doing the work, and thinking about solidarity and what that means and how we show up for this critically important work. I guess just to kind of maybe give people a sense of our family and how we're connected, your late father and my mother are brother and sister. And there were 5 siblings who came over through some chain migration. And there were 11 of us. There were 11 cousins. I'm the youngest of those 11. And kind of like, my big fat Greek wedding, there were 4 Marias, so it was like, this is my cousin Maria, and this is my other cousin Maria. And your sister, Maria, she and I were very close. And I know how I was thinking about her actually as I was, getting ready for this. And, I was feeling a bit emotional because I know how proud she would be of you. And, her death was very difficult for all of us. It was, I think, kind of transformative for all of us because she suffered so much. And she was a mother of 5 children. And that was a challenge. But I was also thinking about your mom and dad and how proud they would be. But then I was laughing because your father was so politically conservative. And I was thinking about how he would feel about your platform. And I think we come by it honestly. As Greeks, like discussion, debate, and politics are very much like a part of our family. But my family, in this relatively conservative extended family, was more progressive. And so I used to really debate with you when you were, going to work on Wall Street.
Yeah. And I inherited my, that happens to many of us. I inherited the political philosophy of my parents to the extent that they had a coherent one, and I don't know that they actually did. They, I began from a place that glorified individual achievement, exalted personal freedom over the collective good. And my father was very combative, as you know. Like when we got together for family gatherings, it was frankly at sometimes embarrassing to see my father trying to engage your father in a political debate. They had very different political views, but your father was such a gentle soul, and my father was always spoiling for a political debate everywhere and anywhere. And it didn't matter the circumstances. And I kind of came out of that tradition, and it took me a while to learn a different way of communication. And it's a process. It's a process that I continue to experience personally every day. And I think that in this leadership contest, I have learned a great deal about how to communicate in ways that are quite different, and I think much more collaborative than the ways in which I was raised, frankly. But at the same time, I owe my father a deep debt of gratitude because he was an iconoclast and fiercely independent in the way that he thought. And that's something that I have retained. I think it's the better part of his nature. I'd like to nurture that in myself, not allow myself to become trapped in the narrow bounds of political discourse, but at the same time, finding the sweet spot between being fiercely independent in one's thinking and thinking critically. That's something that I know you've devoted a lot of your time and energy to, teaching people how to think critically, while at the same time communicating in a manner that is inclusive and non-threatening. So I hope that I am making progress in that regard, and I think that ultimately that is the best way for us to accomplish our common and shared objectives.
Well, on that, I guess, seeing you in this race and knowing you so well, obviously, when you entered public life, your advocacy brought you more and more into the, into public notice and into public life. And I think it's always really interesting for people who know someone very well, the way I do. I mean, I've known you all my life. I'm going to be 46 years old. You're 10 years older than me, but I've really known you all my life. And it's interesting because of, first of all, seeing the level of scrutiny that people who enter public life are subjected to, but also when people have impressions of someone or form opinions, and when you really know someone and what you feel is, wow, they don't know him, you know. And I've often felt that in different ways. You know, sometimes we have talked about like, you know, communication, and this is, you know, and ways of doing that, but also knowing that, you know, people really, sometimes when I see some of the things, that people don't know you. And I guess what's really stood out for me in watching you in this race, there's sort of three things that to me have always been true about you, you know, that have never really wavered, that are kind of core to who you are as a person. Courtney, welcome. We're just finishing up a little conversation. Do you mind if I just finish up my little conversation, and then I want to bring you in and introduce you? I don't know if you want to turn off your video or what you'd be comfortable with, but absolutely welcome. But I think these things that have always been true about you is you've always been very skilled and impassioned in your advocacy. And while when someone's on the other side of that, so when there's disagreement and you're coming from a principled place, or a place of believing, you know, in the rightness and the justness of what you're saying, I think it can be a little bit intimidating because there's a lot of skill there. But as someone who has also had to reach out to you in different times when I was experiencing injustice, and you supported me, it's interesting because that was one, like, there's an incredible amount of safety when you actually have an advocate as skilled as you. So when people are experiencing marginalization or violence or oppression, your advocacy actually creates a lot of safety for those who are experiencing that violence. And sometimes I feel like that gets missed, you know, in different ways. And that's always been true about you. I also feel like you have always been incredibly open-minded, because you are capable of shifts. You don't stay stuck. You listen to evidence, you listen to different perspectives, and you're totally willing to admit, you know, a change that you've experienced as a result of that, and consider evidence. So sometimes when you're portrayed as single-minded, I feel like that's really not you. Like, that's not the person I know. And the third thing that has always been true about you is how hardworking you are. Like, you're indefatigable as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I don't know, like, you have always been incredibly hardworking, and I see that on this campain. And yeah, so that really stands out.
I got that from my mother. My mother was inhumanly hardworking. She would work, you know, 12 hours a day in a Greek diner and come home. My father, you know, bless his soul, he was very, very passionate about intellectual matters, but not one who was inclined to lend his labor to the upkeep of the household and the care of his children. And my mother was literally working every minute of her waking day in every conceivable way to not only sustain the family business, but to keep her 4 children grounded and ensure that they were on the right track. And ultimately, despite the fact that she lacked any high school education at all, she did a pretty good job in that regard. So that's where I got it from, you know. But to go back to what you were saying earlier, you know, it is true that I've kind of assumed in my career and my personal life the role, a very particular role to which I am well suited. And I'm not necessarily well suited to all roles. I don't think any of us are. We have to find our place in this world, and, you know, what our personal mission may be. Mine, I believe, at this point in my life, is to try to bring down walls so that other people who have knowledge and experience and wisdom that I do not possess, because let's be honest, none of us is omniscient. We all bring to the table certain skills and experiences from which others can benefit. My particular talent, I think, my ability, the thing that I was trained for in life, whether, you know, by design or otherwise, was to break down walls and open up paths for others to walk through who have knowledge that I do not possess. And so I hope ultimately that what I can be as the leader of the Green Party of Canada, if I'm accorded the privilege of being the leader of the Green Party of Canada, is to deal with the forces of resistance, the kind of transformational changes that we need, and to open up a space for people who have wisdom and knowledge that I do not have, to actually help us achieve a better more sustainable and just world. And I think that that's kind of a good point for us to bring into the conversation somebody who has a certain type of experience and knowledge and wisdom that I do not have, and that is Courtney Howard, who is, an amazing health professional and brings to bear on this leadership contest a perspective that I can learn from, and that's why we've invited her onto this program. And let me say at the outset, Courtney, that I really appreciate the opportunity that you invited me onto your discussion with the other leadership candidates. That was a great experience for me, and I'm happy that Maria and I can host you this evening in a further conversation.
Yeah, thanks. We really appreciated your contributions as well. I learned a lot from you. So yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I have to say that because I've joined the Green Party for the first time in all of this, and one of the things that's really moved me is actually just how impressive this leadership race is. And it's actually sad that it's not getting as much media attention, because I think that having been someone deeply involved in climate change over the last 2 decades, I mean, these are the conversations that we need to be having. And the fact that they're happening in this leadership race just feels like absolutely where we need to be. So it's been amazing. And I've been really, really taken by everybody's expertise and knowledge. But Courtney, I want to ask you, how are you doing? I mean, you're running in a leadership race, you are an emergency room physician, you're a mother, very, very active on shifting policy. How are you doing?
Well, I haven't worked in the Emerge for a couple of weeks now, so I haven't booked myself in other than to fill in on an emergency basis until the leadership vote. So that's kind of a relief. I'm looking forward to back to school. I think my children have interrupted like 75% of Zoom calls in the last couple of weeks. They sort of first couple of months, they kind of held off, and now they're just like, whatever, mom, you're always on a Zoom call. Like, we need a snack. And so, the internet is now littered with, my 8-year-old asking for, peaches. But that's okay. So, I've really enjoyed a lot of it. Putting the platform together was a chance to read more broadly than I had in a long time. I've been working at the intersection of climate change and health for a decade. And so I've written probably 100 papers that have to do with the health impacts of coal-fired power plants. And so it's really neat to get to write about guaranteed basic income. And, I think, given that it's a pandemic and it's so easy for us to all get removed from one another, it's been really good to have opportunities and actually be required to reach out, to learn from other people, to make new friends. So I think overall, regardless of what happens, it's really added a lot of richness to my last few months.
Amazing. I had to ask, because I've actually been to Yellowknife. I've done some professional learning with one of the high schools there, but one of my best friends lives there, and I have to ask you if you know her, because I know that Yellowknife, for as much as it's big, it's pretty small. Do you know Andrea Becker?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, 100%.
So Andrea lives, off grid on Jolliffe Island. She was maid of honor at my wedding. Actually, Dimitri was master of ceremonies. So this is like the small world that we are. Andrea and I were absolutely best friends. Like, we went to high school together. We were roommates.
Oh, that's awesome.
We have a lifelong bond that will really never be broken. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, she's very much part of the sort of Old Town community that we have down here. We bought my daughter a fiddle earlier in the pandemic, and we asked her which one we should buy. So yeah, no, she really adds a lot of color and art to our community. That's fantastic.
Yeah, she's always been like that. It's amazing. She's got a new album that's come out and recently, but very involved there. Well, our theme, our theme for today is about paradigm shifts, and it's about courage and commitment and collaboration to deal with the climate crisis. And so I do want to invite any attendees, if they have questions, to put those in the chat. But I do have some questions for each of you today. So the first question really does center around this theme of courage. So Courtney, you have, I think both of you, and I would include myself as well, because I've been teaching about climate change over 2 decades. I've certainly met with a lot of resistance as an educator, with the way of the climate confusion and the way that people have tried to make controversy where there wasn't controversy in terms of what was happening. But you, Courtney, have had to stand up to opposition around linking health and the extractive industries. Dimitri, you have challenged corporate power and corruption and a corporate agenda that is more about profit than it is about people and the planet. And that's taken a lot of courage, I think, for both of you. And I wanted to ask you what price you've actually paid for your activism, you know, in being an advocate, in being a professional, but also an activist.
I'm going to invite Courtney to go first on this one.
So, you know, I love the question. Actually, so Trevor Hancock is the person, he was a co-founder of both the Green Party and Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. So when I first started this, I was an emerge doc and was looking for my people a little bit in the health community. And so I showed up at the Canadian Public Health Association conference and, you know, went to the panel where he was, and I ended up at the end of the panel standing up and asking about courage and saying, you know, from what I have seen, the major limiting factor in us doing what the evidence is telling us to do is a lack of courage. And I'm curious, Trevor, where you get your courage from. And so I 100% agree that this really is the limiting factor. And in fact, I have a paper coming out in a Lancet journal in a couple of months that really was my attempt to figure out, okay, well, what are all the different elements to this and how can we help them for people? So I think, you know, solidarity is a huge one, telling stories that, you know, increase hope, that let us make sure that we tell the stories of our wins so that people have something to replicate so they know they're not alone. You know, it's something I've actually spent quite a lot of discrete time thinking about, and probably because, you know, it does take a lot of courage to do this work. So I was a competitive gymnast when I was little. So I grew up, you know, throwing myself backwards at balance beams. And I actually think that that ended up being really good training, because just because I'm scared, I don't feel like I'm doing the wrong thing. I recognize that it's, you know, an energetic sort of leap I need to take, but it doesn't mean I'm on the wrong path. And I think that, you know, some of the work I've done has been on eco-anxiety. And really for me, I would say, yes, there is an effort involved in manifesting the courage required to do the work. But overall, there's been a huge payoff in terms of the peace that I get from knowing that I'm contributing all that I can. I don't actually think I could be a mom at this moment in time without doing the work. And so the courage has been, you know, an element of that. I have been lucky to have been able to walk the line pretty well between academics and stay on sort of the right side of conservative medicine. That has to do with just, you know, I like writing nerdy things. So if you're kind of like academically inclined, it's easier to keep, you know, more conservative forces on board. But certainly there's been a lot of wearing of hats, of different hats, and making sure that I have the right people on board with me to support me when I am taking those big leaps. And I've been lucky to have them.
Thank you. Yeah. And you mentioned eco-anxiety, and I see that you have Rachel Molina Chan coming on your show, who I know because of my work in education, and yeah, some really important work there. Dimitri, how about you? What kind of price have you paid for courage and for your activism?
Well, I haven't had to pay, fortunately, an economic price, because I didn't really become fully embroiled in activism until a point in my life where I'd achieved it. This was not by design. It just sort of, I became, you know, committed to various causes as an activist at a point in my life where I didn't have to be concerned about economic privation. So in that regard, I was fortunate, and in fact, the fact of my good fortune has always been something that has been a foundation of my activism. Always being cognizant of the fact that I am whatever disadvantages my parents have had to overcome, and they had to overcome many disadvantages, as did yours. I myself have never had to live in a condition of poverty. I've never had to experience war. I grew up with some bigotry, but not anywhere near the kind of racism that the more marginalized groups in our society have endured. So what has kept me steadfast and committed throughout all of this is an understanding that I am extraordinarily fortunate to be in the position that I am in my life, and to have had the experiences that I've had. But it has been hard at times, because when you confront persons in positions of power who are accustomed to having their way and are prepared to use, you know, whatever tactic might be effective in maintaining and even enhancing their power, it can be very hurtful. You know, the things that I've had to endure having said about me, I'm not a robot, I'm a human being. I've lost a lot of sleep over the things that have sometimes been said about me by persons who are opposed to my activism. Frankly, I couldn't have gotten through all of that without the support of people around me. You know, like yourself, Maria, my incredible partner, Farida, and my children, and the extraordinary network of activists around this country and abroad who've come together. And these people, you know, who are doing these things, including people in our own campaign, like yourself, you know, assisting in any way you can with bringing forward the goals and the mission of this campaign. They're not doing it because of me. They're doing it because they have a shared vision and a commitment to justice and peace and sustainability. And it is inspiring and a source of immense strength to me to be able to work with these people on a daily basis. Without them, I couldn't have done what I've done as an activist. I couldn't have gotten through it emotionally, frankly. That support has been absolutely critical to whatever I might have accomplished in my role as an activist.
So kind of staying on this theme of courage a little bit, I think it's something that we all need to have right now, because we are facing, you know, it is here and it's impacting some more than others. You know, the climate crisis, the climate emergency is very present for some communities, both here, you know, on Turtle Island and in other parts of the world. As we face this climate emergency that we do have limited time to address, there is urgency. There is a need to challenge incrementalism. What paradigms are each of you proposing to meet really the greatest existential threat that we've faced as human beings? What are these paradigm shifts that we need?
Maybe I'll go first on that one, since I invited Courtney to go first last time. You know, someone who's very close to both you and me, Maria, Atul, your wonderful husband, who is playing an absolutely critical role in our campaign, pointed out to me recently that the origin of the word radical is getting to the root of the problem, something that I hadn't known until he pointed that out to me. And I think really the kind of shift that we need to undergo, the shifts we need to undergo, start really there. Let's identify the root of the problem, and let's do that in a way that is fearless and true to what we know in our hearts and our minds and our souls, regardless of whatever obstacles we may have to overcome. And the root of the problem, I believe, is that we have been misled as to the fundamental nature of who we are as human beings. We've been led to believe, and I've said this more times than I can count on the campaign trail, that we are rational maximizers of our self-interest, that we are inherently and oftentimes ruthlessly competitive, that we naturally thrive and operate in a world in which there are winners and losers, and that we prefer our own aggrandizement over the collective good. And I just don't think that that defines who we are ultimately. And it took me a long place to get there. A long time to get to this place where I am today in my understanding of human nature. I wasn't fully on board with that vision of human nature when I was younger, as you know. And you know, when I was in law school at the University of Toronto, which was a very competitive place, my classmates, I think almost all of them regarded me as the most intensely competitive person in the entire class. And I now look back on the way that I was in those days, and I kind of shudder to think, like, oh my God, that's really not who I am. That's not who we are. We are fundamentally collaborative, cooperative beings, and we prefer the collective good and peace and justice to a society in which there are winners and losers. And I think that we have to if we're going to have any paradigm shift, it has to begin with the conversation about who we are as human beings and how we've been misled into thinking that we are, you know, these extraordinarily egotistical people who are driving the planet to a point of destruction. To me, it all starts there. And if we can't have that conversation, we're going to have a real difficult time overcoming the obstacles we confront.
Courtney, how about you? So again, what are the paradigm shifts you're proposing to meet these existential threats?
Have you read Humankind, Dimitri?
I have not. I've heard much about it, but I have
You
not.
should read it because he basically says exactly what you just said, or a lot of it. And it's very satisfying. And actually, I'm starting from a pretty similar place. And it's actually just as a result of the experiences I've had with thousands of people on the worst day of their lives. You know, when people come into the Emerge with a cold, they can be kind of whingy a lot of the time. But, but when you tell them that they've just had a massive heart attack, almost without exception, people are graceful and they're courageous and they're funny and they're generous. And so I have watched so many thousands of people rise to the moment that I have this confidence that we can, and that we can request that of them, and that we can help reflect that their good qualities back to them. And I've been actually having an essential running argument with Nick Watts, who's the head of the Lancet Climate Change and Health Collaborative, about this for about 5 years. And I'm going to send him this book and be like, see, I'm right. But, in terms of that, so how do we draw that out? I have spent a lot of time reading over the last couple of months, and I think we need an explicit focus on a well-being economy, because when we look at GDP, it makes really no sense at all that that's our default measure of success. And when you don't have a goal that's meaningful, I really don't see how policymakers are able to evaluate the pros and cons and the risks and benefits of different measures. And so I think it's really important, like at this moment of time, maybe we could sort of get away with sort of sloppy visioning and sloppy accounting before. We really can't. We're in the midst of multiple crises, and we don't have a ton of ecological buffer to use in terms of helping us achieve where we need to be. And so I'm proposing a well-being based economy, as many others have, and a really evidence-based sort of approach to getting there. Because once you make that your goal, all of a sudden you get to use the evidence generated by public health and planetary health researchers the world over that just tells you, okay, well, inequality is bad for health. Okay, we don't want that. We do want a wealth tax. We do want to guarantee basic income. Like, it just makes it very easy to just sort of lay it all out. And so I think, recognizing, I do believe that humans are good. I do believe we need a shared goal and a shared vision to help us get to a place. And I really believe, I spent a lot of time trying to motivate people to take action based on stats. And I couldn't understand why, I'd show up to the Canadian Medical Association General Council and get completely yelled at, particularly around anything that had to do with, the oil sands. And I didn't understand, because they were the ones at the time, I was junior in the profession when I started. And I was like, you guys were the ones who told me to, act based on evidence. I don't understand. And then what I realized was really it was emotion that was guiding their work as opposed to evidence. And so, really recognizing that I look at this moment in time as a diagnosis. When I give people in the Emerge a distressing diagnosis, get all sorts of different emotions. Sometimes people are angry, sometimes people are really sad, some people have tons of questions, some people go away and then they come back later with questions. And so we're going to get all of those different reactions from people. And I think we really need to be compassionate to all of them, because everybody in my experience is doing their best at every moment in time, and then be strategic in how we ourselves react while we are managing our emotions as well. So that's sort of the overall framework that I'm working with.
If I might just build upon that, I think ultimately, and it sounds like you and I are very much in agreement in this, Courtney, that we have to come to grips with the grotesque crisis of inequality in this country. That the inequality is, to my mind, at the heart of our inability to overcome the climate crisis, because there are a small number of people who have so much influence over the media, over government, over the legal system, over other important institutions, even our universities, through their aggregation of enormous, eye-watering amounts of wealth, that they can effectively bend all of those institutions and systems to their will and prevent meaningful change, and particularly the types of dramatic and radical reforms, frankly, that we require in order to resolve the climate crisis. And I don't believe that we can get to where we want to be without dealing with the crisis of inequality in this country. My sense is that you're sympathetic to that view as well. What are your thoughts about that?
Inequality is definitely toxic to health. So, I use the word toxic with hesitancy because it gets sort of bandied about all over the place. But the more I've read about it, the more honestly it is good for nothing. It's been shown to be associated with decreased trust, decreased status of women, decreased health for kids, decreased mental and physical health, increased addictions, increased murder. There is nothing that is good about it. And it's not even good for rich people because then, as we've seen in the US, then they're living in a society that's not functioning. And if your society's not functioning, you can't get your COVID swabs. And despite, no matter how rich you are, you're more likely to get COVID and not have a ventilator accessible to you. And so really, it truly isn't to anybody's benefit. And I think, in a lot of cases we've been, because we haven't, I spent a lot of time on the Parliamentary Budget Officer's website over the last month. Like, I am not the most fun person at the cocktail party right now. I'm like, did you know? But it's illustrative. It really makes you realize that we've been existing, as advocates for things like childcare and that kind of thing in this culture of scarcity that is actually not the case. It's a distribution problem, not a absolute scarcity issue. And so, yeah, when you look at the amount of money that is being offshored, in corporate tax havens, if we harvested that, if we had a 1% net wealth tax, that's $10-12 billion. I think they were estimating about 25 for that. Childcare advocates tell me it's only going to take about 10 billion more federal dollars to have universal public childcare in this country, and that in itself is actually a GDP boost by most estimations. And so, but when I was asking the childcare advocates what I should ask for, they're like, maybe $2 more billion a year. I'm like, but you just told me it was going to take 10 billion to get the job done. And I'm like, we just gave 16 billion in fossil fuel subsidies just since the pandemic started. And so, I think we've been told this story that we don't have enough, and it's kept us quiet when really, it's just in the wrong spots.
I mean, this whole idea of like story, I think, is really important, and the way that narratives shape, what we are. I mean, Dimitri and I started talking about, the fact that we weren't really aware of Indigenous history because it wasn't part of the narrative. It wasn't part of the story that was really taught to us. And they say like those who control the narrative really control the outcomes in so many ways. And I guess, one of the things about evidence is what we're seeing, like there's so much evidence about the deleterious effects of climate change. And yet we still aren't harnessing what needs to be harnessed to address that. I'm having some frustration right now. I'm a teacher. I'm scheduled to go back here in Ontario. This government, there's evidence about what a safe return would be. This government is actively not doing what needs to be done for a safe return in light of that evidence. And so I guess, that's one of the questions I have is we have a lot of times the overwhelming evidence, and yet we still are struggling to do the right thing. And what will that take? So I think that takes me to my second question, like in light of, what's been surfaced here, we are seeing different approaches to tackling the great political, economic, and ecological challenges, of our time. And these are things like grassroots movement building. So some see the grassroots movement building as being absolutely critical to addressing these challenges, to working within existing structures and to bring diverse representation into those existing structures, to have more voices and different voices at the table. And people are making different political commitments to the change that's needed. How would you approach this as a leader? How would you approach these diverse ways of engaging in political change to really tackle these issues?
I'll jump in on the evidence part. So I've spent a lot of time, in the planetary health, public health communities, encouraging people. I've done a lot of advocacy teaching. I've done a lot of policy work, and trying to move academics and doctors down the spectrum, along the spectrum, towards greater policy and political advocacy. But the reality is their inherent incentives aren't aligned with that work at all. And so they're mostly doing it when they're doing it off the side of their desk. They don't get credit when it comes to tenure for most of the work. And they don't, they're kind of swimming upstream in terms of what's sort of seen as acceptable within their professions. And so, and meanwhile, you know, as you see on Twitter, you know, in terms of people reacting to different types of COVID management, they're like, why aren't you listening to us? And so, you know, I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of weeks, you know, taking my community to task, because we're getting outcomes that are perfectly aligned with the systems and practices that we've created, because we have not been funding or encouraging work towards an evidence-based world. And so I think we need to realign academic incentives, because we need them. You know, if this really is a war effort, we need our academics to be helping out. You know, I've done at least 85% of the work I've done on this over the last 10 years for free. I can do this because I can show up to the emergency department, work my tail off, and leave. And also my husband's a pediatrician. So there's an immense amount of privilege involved in what I've been able to do, but that's not scalable. Like, we simply can't scale that. And so we need to change the systems to help other people have this evidence-based influence. And then, you know, as I went through the platform, I was, you know, I kept coming up against, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about fossil fuels or farming, you know, industry influence is the thing that's sort of steering us off track. So how can we combat that? So a couple of things, you know, speaking with senators who've been working, you know, at the intersection of lobbying and policy change for a while, they really feel that our lobbying laws, and we talked a little bit about this on our previous conversation, Dimitri, need to be changed. And so we proposed, and it goes right now, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives showed that fossil, you know, over about a 6-year period, fossil fuel players were out lobbying NGOs by about 5 to 1. So they got 5 meetings with decision makers federally for every meeting by NGOs. Well, when you think about humans being humans and relationships being the thing that often sort of creates bonds of trust that then, you know, lead to change, that is not good. And so we proposed a 1-to-1 ratio, you know, to be audited and targeted for each decision maker, like each individual person. And then also when we look at what has been done successfully, so the Canada Food Guide is this almost magical thing that actually worked incredibly well. It came out within weeks of an international research collaboration and said basically the exact same thing. And when we look at how that came into being, Jane Philpott put up her elbows as health minister and said, we are not going to have closed door meetings with the food and beverage industry because they have a clear conflict of interest that puts an evidence-based product at risk. And so we propose similar strategies for things like, for instance, if we brought about a Climate Accountability Act, you know, the fossil fuel industry should not be involved in closed door meetings with those parts of policy change. So those are some of the ways that, you know, we're trying to bring evidence-based policy about. And, you know, in terms of the greater solidarity, I really think, you know, we're at a moment of such instability. Mental health issues are going to be huge. Like, they're already huge. I'm seeing it tremendously accelerated in my emergency department, and just in general, we're going to have to be so careful with our tone. So I think a really compassionate yet action-oriented tone is what is going to help Canadians feel safe and able to take the next steps.
So I would echo much of what you've had to say, Courtney. I start from the premise that we are now beyond the stage where incrementalism could have sufficed, gradualism could have sufficed. There was a time within our own lifetimes when a gradualist approach would have been sufficient to deal with the emergencies now confronting us. And unfortunately, successive generations of politicians and business leaders squandered the opportunity. So now we are in a position where we need to undergo perhaps, you know, a degree and rapidity of change, perhaps unprecedented in human history and certainly in modern history. And the only way we're going to do that, it seems to me, is to find allies wherever we can find them and unite with them. So one question I get asked quite a bit, you know, do you think it's time for the Green Party to move on from being an activist party and to become a purely professional political party? I actually don't think that those two things are mutually exclusive. And I think, in fact, trying to divide those two functions and separate, you know, activists from political leaders and political movements is not what the doctor, if you'll excuse the pun, has ordered at this particular point in time requires. What we in fact need to do is we need to nourish activist movements, stand shoulder to shoulder with activists, and at times, where appropriate and necessary, engage in peaceful forms of civil disobedience with our friends, brothers, sisters, allies in the activist community. This is something that Elizabeth May did, you know, when she went up to Trans Mountain and got arrested. And the right-wing media, you know, took her to task for that. I thought that was one of her finest moments as a leader of the Green Party of Canada. And I fully support, you know, our passionate engagement with the activist community. Not just any activist community, but those who are principled, those who are pursuing an intelligent, respectful platform. We need to help them and stand with them. We need to find allies in the academic community. You talked about people within academia who are trying to bring change, dramatic change. We need to ally with them. There are people even within the business community, and in particular, there are people within organized labor. You know, something that we can and should do better as a party is understand that there are Canadian workers and you know, and unions like the Canadian Union of Postal Workers who are profoundly and passionately committed to the kinds of dramatic changes that we need, and we need to ally ourselves with them and understand what their concerns, their legitimate needs and concerns are, and speak to their hearts and minds. We ultimately need to find our allies wherever they may be and unite with them in this struggle, because a political movement alone is not going to do it, in my opinion. You know, there's going to be a gap between the time at which this leadership race is decided and the time at which the Green Party of Canada has enough seats in Parliament to actually force legislative change, including the many wonderful legislative proposals that you've talked about and other candidates have talked about. And within that gap is going to, you know, that's going to be very precious time because we have so little time left. So we can't rely simply upon that moment when we achieve the necessary degree of leverage within Parliament. We have to act sooner than that. And so what I want to do is, you know, call upon all the leadership candidates and all the members of this party to understand that we need to find our allies wherever they may be and unite with them in this struggle.
Yeah, I find this question very interesting. Sorry, I'm just going to respond because to me, like the reason why I've moved from putting most of my energy into NGO work into this work is because to me, and I've had a role as a consultant over the last couple of years trying to figure out, you know, what is the unique value proposition of a given organization. For me, in the Canadian context, the unique value proposition of the Green Party is that we are the most evidence-based, ethical, action-oriented group with the ability to get people into Parliament. You know, I've had, you know, like 5 other hats on over the rest of the year where I could do all sorts of things. And there's a tremendous number of groups who can do all that, but they do not have a clear avenue into Parliament. And as we've seen, you know, that's where decisions get made. That's where our joint resources get allocated. And so for me, you know, when I'm picturing these people that agree with you, where we're standing with, I'm like, okay, well, given that that is our unique value proposition, how do we maximize the power of the movement overall? Being really clear on that. Because, you know, many people within the Green Party will wear other hats and will be doing work with other parties, but really, like, they can't do that. And that's super important. So we need to make sure that we're doing that really well. And that doesn't mean waiting until we get into Parliament to doing anything, but that means, you know, working connections that we'll have that they won't have with people in Parliament to distribute information, to strategically position ourselves in order to get things done. You know, there's a lot of things that I'm already understanding that will bring about that we'll be able to do better than other groups. And so I think that it's just really clear we if we are focused, we'll get more done.
So, you know, our final of the themes of today, we had courage, commitment, and collaboration. So looking at collaboration, I think, you know, one of the key things about collaborating is there's a lot of self-reflection, I think, imperative in collaboration. So this is a 2-part question. So the first part is, what have you learned most about yourself in this campaign and about other leadership candidates? You don't have to necessarily speak about every single leadership candidate, but maybe some things that stand out. So what have you learned most about yourself through this leadership campaign, and what have you learned about some of the other leadership candidates.
Dimitri?
How about I answer the first question first and you answer the second question? And then we'll trade. I guess what I've learned about myself, the thing that really, just the first thing that popped into my mind is that, there's this cliche, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I actually have learned about myself that I'm much more open to change than I thought I would be at this stage of my life. I'm not as set in my ways as I thought I would be. I'm 56 years old now. And, we all form our habits over the period of decades of existence. And, I've learned so much that in many ways I feel like I was a child when this race began. I've gone through, it's 7 months I've been in this, Courtney. I think you've been in a little bit less than me, but you've been in this a long time too. And I personally have gone through quite a bit of evolution, and I didn't think that I was capable of changing that much in so short a period of time. So that's what I think I've learned most, is that even at this late stage of life, one is capable of a great deal of learning and, and self and enlightenment. But that is due in no small part to the people around me. A lot of that enlightenment, whatever I've learned, has come from the wonderful people like yourself, Maria, like, Courtney, other people in this leadership race. I think that they've all made me a better human being.
Yeah, in fact, what I would say something relatively similar. I'm at the point in time, I'm a teacher in the emergency department. I've been working on climate change and health longer than almost anybody in the world. And so internationally, I've mostly been doing mentorship, still doing active work myself, but we've actually done really well in Canada in terms of our work on, coal power phase out and fracking and active transport. And so we've been trying to catalyze similar work internationally. And so then all of a sudden, to be very much on the learning curve again, I didn't sort of realize, I didn't put it into context for myself until early July, when all the new learners flip over into their next role in the hospital. And all of a sudden I had this third-year medical student, and it was her third day on the ward in the emerge. And just, she didn't, all these things that you forget are a thing, like, oh, I need a form for the x-ray. Oh, where is the form? And just watching her be in that super painful part of the learning curve made me recognize where I was. I was like, oh, I'm doing that right now too. Right. And it kind of normalized how uncomfortable that is, and it's just sort of made me be like, oh, well, you know what? You actually haven't been on a learning curve this steep in, a couple of decades now. And so it's normal for it to feel this uncomfortable. Look at that poor med student. And then, you think to yourself, well, she can do it, and you got through that before too. So, keep going, and it will get less awkward, and, it'll feel okay. And so, yeah, it's been a bit of a recognition that I think it's easy to get pretty complacent a little bit when you've been doing the same thing for a while, and you start to think you're pretty good at things, and then you get to do new things again. You're like, nope, like, I'm still the trying hard person I've ever been, the making mistakes person I've ever been. But, if we keep going, if we persist, we'll get better. And so, yeah, it's been sort of a humility moment, and also a recognition of, the resilience that at the same time you have built, and you can develop again. And so, yeah, sort of that combination of humility and, okay, well, we actually can do this if we keep going. So, and then in terms of, the thing I've really learned, I think I've actually really appreciated, whereas in the academic and medical community, really, it's usually me just like, come on, guys, we need to do it. It's been a relief to be in a community of people where actually I don't think courage is the limiting factor. Every person who's put their name forward in this race has made themselves extremely vulnerable, and that takes courage. And so it's been, I think that we, of course, there's differences of opinion in the way we want to move forward in the leadership candidates, but there's everybody's anteed up. And I really appreciate that about all of the different contestants. And, that I think has allowed me to learn different things, because I don't have this part of my brain that's preoccupied with trying to sort of drive people forward. And so I've really just appreciated learning that in a different sphere of the world, that courage does exist. And, that means probably we can bring it into other spheres, and also potentially bring some of the pros, the strengths of other spheres into the political arena.
Dimitri, did you want to answer the second part of the question?
Could you remind me about the second part of your question?
So what have you learned about the other leadership candidates?
I think that I've learned that I've come to the conclusion we have a lot more in common than I thought, frankly. So for example, I was on a conversation yesterday with, organized by the wonderful people in PEI, the Greens out in PEI, with Andrew West. And I would say probably Andrew West and I, from terms of our political perspectives, we're probably furthest apart in terms of political perspectives amongst the leadership candidates. And he started to talk about this notion of fiscal responsibility, and he and I have debated this a lot. But it's been difficult to have a real debate about it because there's so many leadership candidates, that people naturally have to confine the amount of time that we speak. But we had an opportunity in a one-on-one setting for him to actually talk about what he means about fiscal responsibility. And by the end of his explanation, I realized that we aren't that as far apart as I had believed. And the more that I interact with the members, the people in this race, there certainly are significant differences. There's no question about that. But there is much more agreement between us than I had believed at the outset. And maybe that's also not just maybe it's a reflection of the fact that we've all learned from each other. And so our differences have been narrowed over the course of this race because we've had some ability to influence each other's thinking in terms of the various issues that we're all debating. So maybe it's just an inevitable outcome of being involved in a healthy and respectful debate over a period of 7 months. But however we got there, I certainly feel that the differences between us are not as great as I had believed at the outset.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to have the last question, and we have had a number of questions as well. And so what I wanted to propose, just because of our time, we don't have time actually for all these questions because our discussion has been very rich, is I wondered if the people who have posted questions might feel comfortable sending their email either to the Team Dimitri website and just say it was the talk with Courtney Howard, or if you're on Zoom, if you wouldn't mind sending it privately in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with. And I will send these questions to both of you, and that you can follow up with some of the questions. But I just, to kind of end, this conversation on these themes of courage, commitment, and collaboration, I wanted to ask each of you how you might see yourselves collaborating with each other as things move forward. Because again, putting the children and putting the more than human world that is suffering so much at the center of all that we're doing, I think is a principle that can guide us all forward.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be a disservice to the party and to the country for us not to work collaboratively, no matter who the winner at the end of this process is. There's so much talent in this race. There's so much goodwill, so much commitment to the core values of the Green Party. And we've, as I just mentioned a moment ago, I think we've learned so much from each other and from the members in engaging in this months-long conversation about the future of the country and the party, that it behooves us to draw upon each other's skills and knowledge in the months and years ahead, whoever the winner in this contest may be. And it's kind of a shame that there has to be a winner, because ultimately, I've said this many times, it's something that I've learned over the course of my life. Collective decision-making almost invariably yields superior outcomes to unilateral decision-making. So I hope that we'll all stay close, that we'll all continue to collaborate in some manner, whatever the outcome may be. And I think that would be in the best interest, not only of the party, but of all of Canadians for us to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I think we all probably have a sort of Rolodex of people that when we, have a question about something, we're like, I'm definitely going to call Bob. Like, Bob's the person, knows this. And really, I certainly know that if I have a question moving forward about corporate power and how best to sort of maneuver, like, I'm going to call you, Dimitri. I hope you're okay with that, because I will.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to talk about it.
And I really think that, you know, that nexus really is super important. You know, I spent a bunch of time reading about farming, and like, if we're going to solve farming and ensure food security, we need to essentially, like, they're all arms of pharmaceutical companies, essentially, or a lot of the giant agriculture corporations. You know, I'm a child of a home economist. I own a farm. I've, you know, resuscitated malnourished children and failed to resuscitate some. You know, food is really important. And, you know, there is a lot of corporate power in our food system. And if we want food security and we want, you know, food in our bellies and we want farmers, like, we're going to have to really, really rearrange that. And, you know, I very much hope to work with you in the future, Dimitri, about fundamental things like that. And I'm sure we will. You know, Canada isn't, as we've just demonstrated with our Yellowknife example, it's not that big. And so, you know, regardless of how we do it, and I think, you know, with all the hats, and then also taking into account the unique value proposition of the Green Party, you know, I'm sure there's ways we'll all be able to work together.
Well, I really want to thank you, Courtney, on behalf of Dimitri Live, for joining us today. It's, you know, it's been wonderful. I know for myself as well, and the work I do around youth well-being and mental health and education. You know, I hope that we continue to stay connected and move that work forward. That's critically important. And again, together, I believe, I think that that's where a lot of the hope comes from, in terms of the urgency and of what we're facing. So thank you so much for joining us. And I know you have a lot of things that you can get to right now, I'm sure. A huge list of things, and wishing you all the best, and, you know, throughout the rest of the campaign. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I knew it was going to be a good conversation, and it was. So thank you for your thoughtfulness. I love the questions. It was lovely to, yeah, hear your thoughts on some of the things we don't get to touch on in these big, giant, you know, 9-person panel debates. And yeah, looking forward to continued collaboration. Bon courage. It's, you know, it's, you know, we're 6 weeks out from, you know, and men at it for 7 months. That's a long time. So, you know, yeah, just keep going, as Jenna Catwin told us. And yeah, we'll see you the next time online.
Thank you, Courtney. And it was a pleasure having you. And cousin, as always, you were a highly skillful moderator and conversationalist. Thank you so much for hosting.
Well, I'm sorry to all those who submitted questions. Our time just went so quickly, and I thought we would be able to address some of these. But again, please do send your email either through Dimitri's website or privately in this chat. We'll keep it open. And we will send these to both Courtney and Dimitri. So please be sure that you do that. And I'm sorry to the participants that we weren't able to get there. Again, the time went so quickly. So thanks to both of you. And yeah, we'll see you both on the campaign trail.
All right, sounds good. At the end, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.